Friends, Romans, countrymen, welcome to Ambivalent Offenders. This is Erin. We are back this week. Sorry, I think any Mark Antony podcast is legally obligated to start with that. Damn it, Shakespeare. How about friends, husbands, podcast hosts, which is just all you? Because we have, drum roll, our guest host back today, my husband, Matthew. He's back again to talk Roman history this time. Say hello, Matthew.
Hey, everybody. We say talk loosely. It's going to be a lot of me asking questions and nodding my head because this is way outside any area where I have much knowledge or familiarity.
Matthew is an American history teacher, and he's joined us on a few episodes already, so you guys might be familiar with him. My lovely co-host, my sister Jamie, should be back with us in a couple episodes, but you're just stuck with us today, me and Matt, and we are here to talk about Mark Antony, or Marcus Antonius, his Roman name. And just a note on the naming conventions. I'm going to go with the modernized Mark Antony to avoid any confusion. Marcus Antonius is not too different, but we're going to go with the thing that we all recognize. Mark Antony is often relegated to the sidelines or spoken about as part of a pair, such as his relationship with Cleopatra, his friendship with Caesar, or later his rivalry with Augustus. But I chose him to figure out who Antony was as a figure in his own right. He's often portrayed as this luxury-loving party boy, rough around the edges with no set beliefs, who eventually sells out his fellow Romans to shack up with an Eastern queen, Cleopatra of Egypt. Do you know much about Mark Antony, Matthew?
I do not. I'm very much in the dark. So
okay.
You're going to be my guide to Mark Antony. And in fact, ancient history, as I said before, is not an area where I feel all that comfortable. So prepare for some really bad questions that reveal my ignorance.
That's okay, because we want everybody who has varied knowledge of Roman history to understand this. So whether you have a lot of Roman history knowledge already or you're coming in blind like Matt is, we want to make sure that this is understandable to all of you guys. So you can keep me honest, Matt. Anyway,
I'll do my best.
The problem that we have with Mark Antony is our sources, because one of history's greatest orators, Cicero, hated Mark Antony and vice versa. And it's Cicero's propaganda campaign against Antony in his speeches called the Philippics, which were given after the assassination of Julius Caesar. That's where we get a lot of information from Mark Antony, and it's kind of cascaded down through the centuries. It's informed how we view Mark Antony. So trying to disentangle the real Antony from the one Cicero crafted is really difficult, if not virtually impossible from this point in time. So I think this is where you had the luxury as an American history teacher. You're not quite as far back.
Luxury? Luxury. Right. So basically what you're saying is, given how far removed we are from his life and the history that surrounds it, it's not likely that we're going to unearth some treasure trove of new, insightful sources on Mark Antony. We're kind of stuck with the existing source work, which on some level we have to acknowledge has these biases wrapped around it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay. A lot of it comes from his enemies, not just Cicero, but later Octavian, which we'll talk about, but it just makes it really difficult. It's the classic, the winners write the history, and Mark Antony is a loser in this war, so that's going to be a big problem. How Cicero and company have portrayed him has informed Mark Antony's portrayals in things like books, movies, and yes, Shakespeare's play, which I referenced at the beginning part of this. So it's going to be complicated. Like I said, Julius Caesar's adopted son / great nephew, Augustus, who's the first emperor of Rome. He's the one who defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra at Actium. He had every incentive and desire to destroy what was left of the great Roman general forever after. Augustus found in Antony a perfect scapegoat. Like I said, most of the sources we have from Antony comes from the imperial period, so from Augustus's age, making them range from outright hostile to some of them are less hostile and more just disapproving. Like I said at the top, I really wanted to find out how much of Antony's awful reputation is deserved. Was he this brilliant general who was the champion of the people in the Roman Republic? Or is he really just as debauched, selfish, and willing to become Cleopatra's plaything, as Cicero and Augustus would have us believe? Hopefully in this series, somewhat of the real Mark Antony will come about, because of course it's going to be more than one episode. We're going to try to learn more about the man behind the legend and the plays. Just a note, I read Mark Antony, A Life by Patricia Southern, as well as some use of a newer Mark Antony biography called A Noble Ruin by W. Jeffrey Tatum. I think the first one, Mark Antony, A Life, is a really excellent overview of all things Mark Antony. So if I quote some things, that's probably going to be pulled from that book. I'm going to use some of Cicero's writings later on. So we will be pulling directly from Cicero. All right. Are you ready to go back to the Roman Republic, Matthew?
I'm going to try. I went back to some college notes, and for the most part, I was able to decipher a lot of my handwriting.
Nice.
But otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and drive blind here. You're going to guide us to a reevaluation. I'm sensing that you're already kind of rooting for him. Are you sure that you're approaching this objectively?
I think fairly objectively. I don't really have my mind made up one way or the other. I know Cleopatra obviously gets a bad rap, so that kind of goes along with Mark Antony. She taints him in some ways, rightly or wrongly, which I think in a lot of ways is wrongly, at least for Cleopatra's side. But I think there are things about Mark Antony that we won't necessarily like. Okay. Although a lot of them are hallmarks of the age. Like, it's not specific just to Mark Antony.
So just so I can prepare myself, there's going to be people murdering their own family members in the service of political gain. That's
perhaps.
Okay. All right. So
perhaps there will be some murder. Absolutely.
I'll brace myself to that. Okay. Fire away.
Well, it's not a Roman history podcast without some murder. Sure. I just got to say that. Okay. Yeah. Let's place ourselves in time and place. I know you told me you were nervous about this episode as you don't feel like you knew enough about Roman history.
Yeah, most of history prior to pants. Basically, where I start to know things, for whatever you can say that I do know, it's once there's pants. And I know there's just not a lot of pants involved, and especially Roman history. There's probably places where you wish there were some pants involved.
Tunics all the way. Tunics and togas.
Yeah. So take us into the context of what the Roman world is like when Mark Antony arrives in it.
Okay. We already talked about one Roman on this podcast, Emperor Claudius. Mark Antony, just to put this in context, is the maternal grandfather of Claudius. So we're going back in time. We're back in the Republican period of Rome, which is where you see some of Rome's most recognizable figures, the men that you would recognize, even if you don't quite know their whole histories, like Cicero, Caesar, Mark Antony. According to the Romans themselves, Rome had kings in the early days of their founding, and those kings were tossed out in about the 6th century BC. And they had been a republic ever since. That's their version of their history. So we're in the Republican age before we get to the emperors. Because of their history, whether it's true or just myth, Romans are going to be always notoriously afraid of monarchy and the idea of one-man rule. Keep that in mind as we go. That's just something that they get really touchy about. If anything, if it looks like monarchy, if it smells like monarchy, they're going to chafe under that. They're not going to like it.
That sounds familiar. That sounds very familiar. I think that, I mean, or at least it did until recently. And
yeah, that did until recently. We would understand that here in America.
yeah, a certain kind of
now,
inborn hostility towards monarchical privilege and the centralization of power. It does sound familiar.
our America and Rome's quote unquote founding stories seem pretty similar.
Yeah, there were later generations who wore pants, who were animated by similar anxieties. All right, so he's born before the full collapse of what we would call the late Roman Republic.
Yeah, he's technically in the late Republic at this point. We'll talk a little bit about that and what that means here in just a minute, but I did want to give you an overview of, since we don't have emperors, what does the Roman structure look like in terms of the politics of it all? I know you might have done a tiny bit of research before this. Do you know how Rome was structured back then?
Well, I have a rough idea, but where I always need help is that I know there are institutions like the Senate, for example, but then there are also social classes. And in some cases, those are, for all intents purposes, synonymous with one another, like in the Senate, for example. But in other cases, I know they're not. So I guess what I always struggle to navigate is you have like the institutional structure, local magistrates, tribunes, senators, generals. Eventually you have colonial territory. But then at the same time, you have, equestrians and plebeians and proletarians.
It's a lot.
It's a lot to dissect. Any kind of crash course you can give us in that would help me a lot. And then maybe I can help a little bit insofar as I know there are going to be some cases where just naturally, as a listener, we want to map it over into some of our modern political structures. And we will learn right away that, the Roman Senate is not the U.S. Senate, or at least historically it wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Maybe that's about to change. Take us through, if the late Republic were a tree and you just split it down the middle and we started counting rings, what would we see?
In terms of the political structure, like you mentioned, the Senate is the political organ, the political center of Rome. It does have limited powers. It doesn't necessarily make laws, and it's led each year by two consuls. So think of them as kind of co-presidents. They had a lot of power, including veto power, or imperium. But since there are two of them, they could veto each other's most egregious acts. Again, don't want one-man rule, too much like monarchy. But they have a lot of power when they're there. The check on that is, again, two of them, and the fact that the terms only lasted 1 year. So that was going to keep the worst from happening. The Senate's made up of the richest people. They had a huge amount of wealth. You had to have a huge amount of wealth to be in the Senate. They're not men of the people. They would not have classified themselves as that.
No.
Yes, it's shocking.
Okay. So you're saying this Senate, it doesn't look like the rest of the Italian peninsula.
It does not. I know, so shocking.
Astonishing to me. But I think we are supposed to be reminded that they cannot technically make law. That's left to other elements in the system. But they are the machinery of the law, in the sense that they control the treasury. They negotiate treaties. They can dispatch generals throughout the Mediterranean. So they're not purely an advisory body. They do have their hands in the machinery of government.
Yes, and technically, once you finished your term as consul, you could become a proconsul or proconsular. We technically call them governors. So that's when you would go out to a province and become a governor, earn lots of money, because usually it was rife with bribery. They would earn a huge amount of money just by what we would consider unsavory means. You could go on and do that and become a governor after you were done. But they're at the top of the ladder in terms of political structure.
Oh, and we should point out their wealth and status does have to be born out of land ownership. They're not allowed to engage in trade and commerce.
Mhm.
So they're sort of like a classical vision of like the House of Lords, where your power is based on title. You know, you're the Archbishop of this, or you've had this estate in Northumbria for God knows how long. But they're not supposed to be caught up in trade and commercial relationships, although that particular community has a voice in the system too.
Yes, there is supposed to be a role to help the quote unquote ordinary people, the plebs, short for plebeians. They're the lower status, not even just like what we would consider the lowest of the low, but also people who just weren't born to huge wealth. Don't just think of this as like the dirt poor. There was this office of the tribune of the plebs, and it has that all-important veto power. So the same thing as consuls. So that is very important. It's supposed to be another check on power and to prevent power from, once again, getting in the hands of one person. At this point, things are not going well. So the tribune of the plebs is just rife with bribery, and it's pretty questionable whether or not it's actually doing anything that, actual ordinary people would want it to do. That is something to think about. These offices, besides that, are pretty rife with bribery, use of political violence in order to get what people want. Just keep that in mind.
Now, 2 questions, one of which I know the answer to, but I think it would be very good for listeners to hear. And then the other one I don't have an answer for. But I guess the first thing would be none of these guardrails, these rules about term lengths and veto power, and none of that's actually written down, right?
I don't think so, no.
They've got that 12-table foundation, but they haven't actually. It's more like the British Constitution. It's a series of precedents and norms.
Exactly.
Which sounds familiar.
Yes, which is great when people follow them.
Right.
But as we'll start to hear, the decline of the Roman Republic and its eventual fall is going to be because these norms are going to be shattered until the system does not resemble what it started off as. Technically, these Roman offices all have age limits. They have term limits. You can't do them back to back, but that's all going to change in the late Republic. So that's when Mark Antony is born. Things aren't looking so great. He's at the very end of the Roman Republic before it's ruled by the emperors. As I said in the beginning, it's the man that Mark Antony fights and loses to Octavian, who becomes Augustus, which is just a title. Augustus is the first Roman emperor. So this republic, just think of it, the one that we've described, the one Antony's born and raised in, is in trouble. It's a republic on its knees.
So my second question would be directly connected to that. When you say that these institutions had become rife with corruption and that bribery was commonplace, this is a dumb question, but had it reached a stage where some of that conduct was considered a norm? Like in professional sports, there's a certain degree of cheating that's considered to be...
That's built in.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of professional baseball, because you have to have a sports metaphor if you're going to talk about history. I mean, you have to do it.
You're appealing to the men in the audience.
But, before the pitch-com thing, or as a college football fan, you know about all the controversies about sign stealing. One of the discussions that I know took place on the baseball side was, well, if you're a runner on second, it's your job to try and steal the sign. And in politics, we went through a period in the early republic in the United States where, as a president, you were only supposed to exercise your veto power if you felt that the bill presented to you by the House and the Senate was in some way a breach of the Constitution. You couldn't just veto something because you didn't like it, right? And then post Andrew Jackson, It just, no, now it's the norm
Mhm.
that we're going to take a more partisan approach, maybe a more competitive or cutthroat approach to political discourse. And the president can just whip out the veto pen purely on spite, in theory, if they wanted to. So I guess
Mhm.
that's what I'm curious about. Had this become sort of a cultural norm, that these officers were sort of for hire, and that if you had enough money, you could
Absolutely.
bypass all the guardrails? Okay. Okay. So it was really, this is a
Money and
system in
prestige.
atrophy here. Things are
Yeah.
falling apart. That he's born into kind of a crumbling architecture.
Yeah. Money can, as always, money in politics, it can buy you a certain amount of things. There are still governors and such who get prosecuted for really egregious acts. But you have to be doing something pretty far out in order to do that. Everything else, yeah, just the normal bribery. This is where, if you're getting elected to an office, men will put on like gladiatorial games and such games of any sort in order to get those votes. That's par for the course. But yeah, it's certainly a system in atrophy, and we will see it's not designed. It's not going to hold up to a few different stressors, which in large part are these strong men and the push and pull of these political factions in the Roman Senate, which sounds very familiar. It's not political parties, but political factions that is tearing the republic apart piece by piece. Think of it maybe as a little paper cut here and there, but now the cuts are getting deeper. In terms of the factions in the Senate, you have the optimates. They're sometimes called the best men. Debatable, actually. They're the more conservative leaning faction. Think of them like the oligarchs like Cicero, Brutus, and Pompey the Great. They want nothing to change. Thank you very much. Everything is great. And then there's the populares or the populists. That's the other side of the factions. These were men like Julius Caesar and earlier the Gracchi. They, at least in words and deeds, wanted to help the normal people of Rome. They appealed to the masses with things like land reform, which you mentioned already. Like you said, this huge chunk of land is being held in the hands of the ultra-rich senatorial class, leaving a giant portion of the population without land. And in these days, land's currency, land is money, land is how you survive. So this is not great for the normal people. And the populares or the populists, they're really pushing for things to change, which does not make the optimates very happy. Of course, these men, the populares, I just want to say, like their rivals, the optimates, they're still from the wealthiest and oldest of Roman families. So don't think of the populares as being from the lower class, even if they're trying to appeal to the masses.
Right. In much the same way, if you're in 17th century Britain, the House of Commons is not going to have a coal miner in it.
Yeah.
It might have somebody who owns a coal mine, but it's not going to have somebody who works there. Looking at my own notes from college, I remember that, if I'm interpreting my handwriting correctly, as the late Republic consolidated the Italian peninsula and began getting into scuffles with those post-Hellenic kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great and eventually Carthage, they acquire a lot of territory, both inside and outside the Italian peninsula. And suddenly you have all of these vast estates, the latifundia, that can be worked by, this sounds familiar, enslaved
Slaves.
labor,
Yes.
which displaces small working class farmers and soldiers returning from battles in far-flung, rival empires, suddenly don't have employment, don't have land. So you're saying that the populares, that faction, is obviously concerned about this and at least claims to sort of be their voice within the political architecture of the late Republic, whereas the optimates are completely content with where the system
Status quo. Yep.
Right. Okay.
Exactly.
So does that mean they're just willfully blind to these problems, or are too seduced by the benefits that they derive from owning most of those estates?
I think we'll never really know the motives behind it, but I think probably a little bit of both. I do think that, yeah, the land reform part is really big. I mentioned the Gracchi earlier as being populare. So they're ones that I think, again, you can debate whether or not they were just trying to get power by appealing to the masses about land reform, or if, they really did believe it. And based on what happened to them, I think they might have really believed it. They tried to get land reform and many other reforms when they held the office of the tribune of the plebs. And both brothers were assassinated because of it. You're starting to see this pattern. Before long, constant civil war is the horrible, destabilizing outcome of a system that's just not working.
You should mention who those brothers were.
The Gracchi.
Well, just that they were advocates for reform, but in the timeline, help me out, they are 30 years before Mark Antony, or 100 years before, or how do they fit into the chronology?
They're in like 133 BC. So the 130s, 120s BC. Mark Antony's 83. So a couple decades later.
So, okay. So, and obviously, he's not going to have political consciousness until he's probably in his 20s, but they would be in the rear view mirror, or the rear view mirror of the chariot, I guess.
The wagon.
There would be a kind of collective awareness of unrest and discontent, and a sense that maybe things were unstable and old traditions were creaking. Okay, great.
Yeah, these problems have not been solved. It's basically stretched into Mark Antony's time and a little bit before. So, for example, you'll get Marius, a populist, and Sulla, and Optimates, two men who represented each faction. They fight each other in the early days of Julius Caesar's life. We'll talk a little bit about that later because Mark Antony's family is also impacted. And then again, obviously, Mark Antony is going to live through another civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And then Antony is going to lose his life fighting against the future emperor Augustus. So they're fighting the same battles over and over again. Rinse, repeat. You get the idea. And these men, these strong men like Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, they're men who are allowed to bypass the usual age requirements for offices. In Rome, we already hinted at this, the slow erosion of norms is eating away at the Republic, especially once men like Caesar get hold of an army and never let it go. That fear of a one-man rule, of a monarchy or pseudo-monarchy, that's seeming like it's going to happen sooner rather than later. We'll be seeing a lot of that in the story, but I wanted to point it out before it started, before we got to Mark Antony, because you'll see these patterns. Of course, this is a really simplified explanation for what's happening, and there's a lot more going on in the Roman Republic and the late Roman Republic, but that's just a little flavor of the time in which Mark Antony's born and growing up. It's a violent world. Men can be murdered in the street and are, including in our story. So let's get into Mark Antony himself. He's born on January 14th. So we know this because later on it's declared a day in which you couldn't do business, and what they called an unlucky day. So this is something that later Octavian / Augustus makes. It's one of the legacies of Antony's loss to him.
Oh, but doesn't he introduce a new calendar? So don't they have to redo the math so that it...
I don't know. I know they do.
I could swear he introduces a new calendar.
Well, I'm sure no matter in whatever calendar it is, January.
I bet that meant there were 2 unlucky days.
It might be. Well, there would have been a lot of ones. But you might be asking what year he's born. Well, we don't know. So Antony doesn't really show up in our historical record until he's a full-fledged adult, taking part in Julius Caesar's wars. At his death, it's said that he's between 51 to 56 years old. Different sources say different things. The general consensus will place his birth year as 83 BC. So we've got January 14th, 83 BC. Antony's family are wealthy, but not hugely so. And they're also not super influential in terms of families in Rome. Technically, they're the plebeians. So in terms of social order, we didn't talk about this before, but there's patricians. They're the highest of the high, blue bloods, aristocratic. Then you have the plebeians are basically everybody else, but you could still be wealthy and in the Senate if you were a plebeian.
But he's not proletarian.
No.
Yeah. He doesn't have truly humble, gritty roots, but no one in his family had ever been in the Senate before, for example.
They had, yeah.
Oh, they had. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So help me out here. A plebeian family could put someone in the Senate?
Yep. Yeah. So the plebeians originally weren't able to be in the Senate, but things have changed at this point in time in the Republic, and they could be members of the Senate. They just weren't from the really high aristocratic families. Those were very few in numbers.
The optimates probably wouldn't let you be a part of their faction, but you could still be there.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is like...
Well, you said Caesar's family, when they arrived, you said he was identified with the conservative faction, didn't you?
No, I think you're thinking Cicero. So Cicero is conservative.
That's right.
Yeah.
See, that's one of my dumb questions. So you're saying, there is some degree of social mobility.
There is. Okay. There is. I mean, I think there is some fluidity. His family are wealthy. They're not toiling the land. They're not shopkeepers. They're wealthy. They hadn't had a consul in the family tree, which we talked about is really important for prestige. So to be very prestigious, you would have had consuls in your family all the way back for decades or centuries. Mark Antony's family had one, but it was his grandfather, Antony's grandfather. So it's not that far back. And the further back you could trace your line with consuls, the more political and social clout you had in Rome. The new men like Cicero, who will be Antony's future enemy, they're the first in their family to be senators. And oh boy, with the other Roman families, make sure that you knew that you were not one of them. So even Cicero, who aligns himself with the conservative faction and is allies to people with great families and heritage, they don't really quite see him as one of them. He's always a little bit of an outsider.
So what we're talking about here these are socially maintained, sort of like old wealth versus new. It's not that any of this is like formalized in law, that you are a member of this caste and can't necessarily navigate out of it. When we talk about these social classes, we're not necessarily talking about formalized restrictions where these families are segregated from one another. What we're talking about is sort of like tensions between old wealth and new wealth.
Yep.
Where if you've gone 7 or 8 generations without a consul in your family tree, you might be perceived as a great house or a great family that's on the decline. And you would also have other families like Cicero's that seem to be gaining momentum and social status. Got it.
There's always that tension, and we'll talk about some of the outcomes of that tension here in a little bit. But Antony's grandfather, the one who was a consul, he's killed in a purge in a prescription in 87 BC. So a few years before Antony's born. So this was the outcome of choosing the wrong side in that previous civil war I mentioned between Marius and Sulla. So Sulla is going to eventually be the victor, but Marius takes Rome at one point. And Antony's grandfather was one of many senators who were killed for their allegiance to Sulla. So again, you're seeing that civil war is really starting to decimate the populations. Even senators are getting killed.
We know when those senators are killed, is it just considered to be, well, this is an act that we undertake as part of the normal spoils of war? Or was there some pretense of saying, oh, these are enemies of the Republic, these are dangers to the state? Did they have trials, was it Stalin purging his officers, or was it just, sorry, you lost, so it's time to lose your head?
It's a little bit of both. Normally, you would have a list of quote unquote enemies. They would be considered enemies of the state. It was considered state-sanctioned violence. You couldn't do business with them. You certainly couldn't help them flee, but you couldn't be harboring a fugitive. They tried to flee, which I believe Mark Antony's grandfather did. You were allied with the other guy. I'm sorry. Technically, if you're a Roman citizen, you are obligated to have a trial. I don't think that these necessarily went through the normal order of things, but yeah, it was sort of, well, you supported the other guy.
Understood. So it's already kind of bloody and dangerous even before he arrives.
Yes, and Antony on his maternal side too also had men who were killed in the Civil War. So it's a reminder to Mark Antony growing up that choosing the wrong side could and would get you killed. As for Antony's parents, Antony's mom's named Julia, and she's actually a Caesar. So Antony is distantly related to his future friend and ally, Julius Caesar. Not closely related, but she's part of that same familial line. Antony's father was Marcus Antonius, because yes, the Romans all have the same names. So if you think the Catherines and Annes in Tudor history is bad, wait until you get 5 Antonias. There's a lot of Marcus Antonius, so I'm going to try to differentiate them when I can.
That is frustrating. I do struggle with that.
If I'm referring to his dad, I'm going to call him Marcus Antonius, even though that's technically Mark Antony's name. But that'll kind of differentiate them. Antony's father actually fought pirates in Crete, which I think is pretty badass, fighting pirates.
Cool.
This, though, ultimately went badly for him, and he died of illness after suffering a defeat. Mark Antony was around 11 when his dad died, and his dad gets a bad rap, his bad reputation, but we think that's more likely due to that literary trope that Mark Antony's doomed to be a failure from the very start, from his very biology. So I think we can kind of take that with a grain of salt. There is some debate, too, about whether Antony's father left the family with enormous debts. This also might be more of an exaggeration than reality, but you do see it in the ancient sources. Cicero really likes to throw around that Antony had a lot of debt. Well, he does get himself in some debt later on, but that's all his own fault, not necessarily his father's.
Do we know if he has siblings?
He does. He does have a few siblings. He has some brothers that we will talk about later on. In terms of his family, there's Mark Antony, then he has Antonia, which is, again, we'll see a lot of Antonias because anytime anybody's named Marcus Antonius, their daughters will be named Antonia. Then we have Gaius Antonius and Lucius Antonius. So there's 3 boys and a girl.
And what do we know about his mother?
So his mother does remarry pretty quick to another senator. So Lentulus, he was a consul, so really good. We already talked about that's
high status.
Yes. And he does seem to have been, from what we can tell, a pretty loving stepfather to young Mark Antony and his siblings. However, the wheel of fortune was to turn again when in 70 BC, his stepfather is actually forced out of the Senate due to some political winds changing. So this is where we get another important man in Rome, a man who's winning battles left, right, gaining more and more power along with it, Pompey the Great. So remember that name. He's going to come up later.
Future member of the triumvirate.
Yes. It's Pompey, along with Crassus, his fellow consul, who put down Spartacus's revolt, too. So you should know Crassus. He's the bad guy from the Spartacus movie. Have you seen Spartacus?
I have not, but I know that Crassus
Me neither.
Crassus was, his chief center of power came from his wealth,
Money.
right?
Yes.
Right.
Money.
In fact, he was the wealthiest Roman, right?
Man in Rome. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a story that he basically had his own private fire brigade. So when
This is the guy who would then threaten, like, sell me your property or the fire brigade won't put it out. Okay.
Yep. Exactly. Yeah. Gotta love it. You gotta love it.
Is that true, or are we sure that's true? That just sounds like
I don't
something
know.
that has to be apocryphal.
That's probably, I'm sure it's not true, but I think the point is that people thought that it could be true.
Right. Yeah.
It's more about,
people felt it was plausible. So
yes.
okay. Speaks to his character. Wow, I'm shocked to see people of such enormous wealth having
Well,
ingratiated themselves into the corridors of power like this.
it's so crazy. So crazy.
History is just a treadmill, I suppose.
It is. I'm not going to get into the details of the disagreement. It doesn't really matter. The disagreement between Antony's stepfather and Pompey the Great and Crassus. But
It leads to his expulsion from the Senate.
yes, so he's basically pushed out of politics. He'd have to start from the very beginning, the ladder of the offices for Roman men. So it's really humiliating for a man who had been at the very tippy top as a consul. He basically has to start all the way from scratch. The book says, and I think puts it best when it says of these early years of Mark Antony, quote, as a young man, Antony's circumstances were far from ideal, conveying the potential but little actual hope of a brilliant future. He started life bankrupt because of his father's debts. His stepfather, Lentulus, had been pushed far back along the path to a lucrative career. It was too late to begin to make overtures to Pompey, the one man in Rome who counted for anything and could influence the Senate, end quote.
And Pompey was the great military.
Yes, he's kind of, think of Pompey as Caesar before Caesar. He's winning battles left, right. He's making a name for himself.
So we already have a scenario in which there's a great center of economic power, Crassus, and then this great center of military muscle, which is Pompey.
Yes.
And if you're not friends with either one of them, good luck.
Yeah,
okay.
You're screwed. You're sorry. Get in the back of the line. We're helping our friends first. But of course, in Rome, things could get worse. And they did for Mark Antony and his family when Antony's around 19 years old. The Catiline conspiracy, which has been mentioned a few times on this podcast in passing, would bring about the death of Antony's beloved stepfather. So I'm going to do like a really brief overview of the conspiracy because it's a lot. We want to cover it in more detail in an episode, either on Catiline himself or Cicero, who is the man who puts the conspiracy down. Essentially, what happens is Cicero, who's consul, and he's, again, very famous for his speeches, he quote unquote found out a conspiracy in 63 BC to overthrow the Roman Republic. The man at the head of the conspiracy was supposedly the very aristocratic blue blood Catiline. So Catiline's a playboy, eternally bankrupt with tons of debt. You get the idea that he's very entitled because of his lineage. Despite that heritage, though, the family hadn't really done much of anything in recent years. You kind of mentioned before, like that push and pull of there's these new men who are coming in, becoming senators like Cicero, and Catiline's the opposite, where his family is very good, but they haven't really done much, and he's certainly not doing much. He's so entitled that after being defeated multiple times for consul, including by Cicero, who he would have felt was pretty far beneath him, being a new man, Catiline decided to say, fuck it, I'm going to launch a coup.
Okay.
Coups are very popular. They're very trendy right now, as well as in the past. So to get followers for his conspiracy, Catiline appealed to the poorest of the poor in Rome by, what do you think would be like the thing that would get most people to want to follow you?
Well, you could land reform, or I guess that might take too long, cash.
Basically.
Okay.
So he's going to cancel debts. He's going to abolish debts, which is great for him because he's cut a lot of his own very conveniently. Supposedly, he's going to abolish debts and take over the government after killing his rivals, of course.
Oh.
This is the story that Cicero gives us. So huge asterisks, because Cicero is one of our very few sources on this. And he's at the heart of it. He's very involved. So we really need to think hard about believing everything he says. What happens is Cicero gives a speech in the Senate denouncing Catiline, with Catiline sitting right there. He's given him everything. He's sitting right there and he's telling the Senate that Catiline's going to launch this coup. He's planning it. We need to do something. Catiline flees afterwards. which again, question mark if was really planning a coup or is he fleeing because Cicero just put a giant bullseye on his back?
Okay.
We don't really know.
Yeah. So that's going to remain another mystery then.
Yes, the jury's out. A lot of people don't think that Catiline was planning this like huge overthrow of the Republic. Even a lot of the leading men, a lot of the leading senators were kind of like shrug about the whole thing. They weren't really believing the rumors that Cicero was saying. But Cicero's obsessed. He's not going to let it go. And in the end, Cicero goes around the usual order of things and gives himself emergency powers to have the men associated with the conspiracy executed without trial. For the Romans who are obsessed with the law and the regular order of things, this is unthinkable. You don't, as I said before, you don't treat Roman citizens this way. Roman citizens can't be executed without a trial, but Cicero does. He's going to defend it and saying that he had to do it. But again, there's debate about whether the conspiracy really existed or existed to the extent that Cicero made it out to be. So Mark Antony's stepfather had apparently helped Catiline try to get help from some Gauls. You know, they're like, okay, let's get some Gallic tribes to help us overthrow the Republic.
So this conspiracy now involves the French.
As the best ones do.
Okay.
Possibly. Supposedly the Gauls had people had come to them and asked them, and then the Gauls just went back to the Romans, and Cicero were like, hey, did you guys know that this is going on? But again, we don't know was Catiline pushed into this because Cicero, said, hey, he's doing a coup, and then Catiline's been pushed out. He's on the run. What else does he have to do but do the thing that Cicero said that he was going to do, or if this was the plan all along? But anyway, the point is Mark Antony's stepfather's implicated, and he's executed along with a handful of other men. Catiline's going to be eventually killed soon, too. He's not in Rome, so he's not killed at this point, but he'll be killed soon after.
But the stain of alleged treason does not filter down to his stepson? Like he's allowed to rise? Well, first of all, he survives the purge, so they're apparently not being completely ruthless.
No, it's not like they're killing the whole family, so that is good. But I think it would we will see Mark Antony doesn't have an illustrious career, at least for a while. So perhaps it does. Perhaps he is, not somebody that people want to take on as a client. I don't know if people would necessarily want to be associated with him after this, because Cicero never lets anybody forget that he took down this Catiline conspiracy. He talks about it for the rest of his life. So I don't think you get very far without somebody pointing out, hey, your stepdad was involved. And actually, Mark Antony does say later on that the family wasn't able to get the body of his stepfather back. They had to plead with Cicero's wife, and then they were able to get to the body. So there's some bad blood here, we will say. We can do a little asterisk on that because Antony says that at a time when Cicero and him are mortal enemies. So again, you might want to question whether or not this actually happened. But this does set Antony and Cicero on a collision course. Antony, with good reason, would have no love for Cicero, and Cicero, in time, would learn to loathe the young man who was fatherless twice over. It would be a battle to the death eventually. But Antony's life had to go on. He got married for the first time to his cousin, Antonia. I told you there's going to be a shit ton of Antonias, and it's always a cousin.
Okay. Well, I guess that makes it easier to keep track of. If you don't know the answer, you just choose Antonia, and you're like, I'm probably going to get it right.
Because he also has if you remember, his sister's name's Antonia, and then Mark Antony will have at least 2 daughters named Antonia. There's no imagination in Roman naming conventions.
They should have just used numbers. I mean, if you're going to be that lacking in creativity, you might as well just assign people numbers. But then again, that would have been Roman numerals, and that probably would have just driven everybody nuts.
I have to stare really close when I do the Roman numerals. I'm like, Oh, God.
That's always been my theory as to the real explanation for the empire's collapse is trying to do long division with Roman numeral.
It's a good theory.
That's one of my profoundly stupid theories, but it's there and I'm not going to give it up.
Yeah. Well, now it's getting broadcast.
Yeah, the whole world now knows, but you know, the Arabs, as soon as they saw that, in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, no, we're going to use our numbers and some of these things we've borrowed from India, and we're going to solve this problem once and for all. Mm-hmm. Also, a 0 would be nice. It would be good maybe to have a 0. Yeah, some of the math might be easier if we had a 0.
I don't know.
I'm pulling you off of your narrative thread.
I think math with Arabic numbers versus Roman numerals is equally baffling to me. But anyway, we do know, he marries a cousin, Antonia. He has a daughter with her named...
Let me guess. Starts with an A?
Yes.
Okay. This is what, our fourth Antonia now?
I think third. We're on our third, and there will be never-ending Antonias. He also has children with the daughter of a freedman, so a freed slave. So someone much further down the social order. We don't know much about these children, just that they existed. But mainly what Mark Antony did in these years was drink, party, womanize, get himself further and further into debt doing all of those. So it's like the classic college experience. The 20s experience is universal, apparently.
Okay. Right. Yeah, he's pretty much following a modern pattern there.
Yes, and he has a group of friends with equally bad reputations. It's a who's who of horribly behaved men in history. There's Clodius Pulca, who might have been having an affair with one of Julius Caesar's wives, causing Caesar to divorce her. That's where you get the phrase, Caesar's wife must be above reproach. Another one of Antony's friends is Scribonius Curio. The Curio friendship might have been something a little bit more. Perhaps the two were lovers. You did get hints of that in some of the sources. Curio comes from a very wealthy and very prestigious family. And apparently he even offered to stand as guarantee for Antony's many debts. But then his dad finds out what he was offering and basically tells his son he can't see Mark Antony anymore. So Antony's one of those friends that mothers and fathers don't want their precious children hanging out with.
He's a bad boy.
He is a bad boy. You gotta love a bad boy. Jury's out if a bad boy with a heart of gold. Funny enough, eventually Antony would go on to marry a woman named Fulvia. She's a very infamous woman in Roman history. And Fulvia was married to both Curio and Clodius, so Fulvia definitely has a type. There's talk that maybe Antony and Fulvia were having an affair as early as this time, but that's all conjecture based on them marrying earlier. Maybe they did. I don't know. Wouldn't put it past Mark Antony. But as you can see, Antony's just kind of partying away. And to be a great man in ancient Rome, you had to either be a skilled general like Pompey the Great or Julius Caesar, or a really great orator like Cicero. Antony, at this point, he's not doing either, and he's not even trying to do either. And because he's not involved in great politics at this time, we don't really know what else he was up to. That's just lost to history because he's outside of that realm of history, the stuff that's been recorded. Although Antony's not up to much besides nursing a hangover, there are other men in Rome angling to be the next man in charge.
So we're going to leave him to his lost years here and then figure out what else is happening before he pokes his head back out.
It's around this time we enter into the 60s BC. We get the appearance of Julius Caesar. You know, he was going to show up at some point. I'm just going to do a little background on Caesar because I think you need to know the man. He'll be a huge part of Antony's story and life. So Julius Caesar, he's from a much greater stock than Mark Antony. His family claimed to be descendants of the goddess Venus herself, which is not too shabby of an ancestor.
Do I want to know how you try to authenticate a claim like that?
I don't think you authenticate it. You just say it enough times and then people believe it.
So you don't point to some old photograph and say, look, there's there's my great-great-grandfather.
Venus, she looks great, doesn't
Yeah.
she?
Okay.
I mean, she would look fabulous because she wouldn't age.
Right.
No, I don't. I think you just say it, and people say, "All right, that sounds about right."
People are saying that my great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was Venus.
Venus. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Many people are saying.
Many people are saying.
All right.
I think technically Mark Antony, I think his family claimed descendant from Hercules. So you'll see later on, he allies himself with Hercules. Like he'll sort of dress up as Hercules.
Doesn't that mean everybody he meets is going to try to arm wrestle him? See, I think that's a risky claim. I wouldn't do that one. I'd try and pick some lesser god like Hermes or Mercury. You need a package on your doorstep by next Tuesday. I can do it. My great-great-great-great-grandfather was the messenger god.
I was going to say maybe that's a bad thing about being the ancestor of Venus, too. Everybody who sleeps with you is going to expect you to be the very best.
Yeah, that was, I didn't know Venus was that fast. Yeah, I could see that being a problem.
Well, Julius Caesar definitely had his share of, I was going to say like women, but he liked men too. So he's just a man who liked to fuck.
He just loved life. He just loved life.
Well, Caesar's well on his way to earning his fame as he became a governor of Spain. He got a lot of money by the backing of Crassus, who, as we mentioned, was the richest man in Rome. And then he uses Crassus's bank account to get elected as consul. So Romans marked the years by the names of the consuls. And Caesar so outshone his other consul that year that people quipped it was the year of Julius and Caesar, which I think is a really good joke. I like it.
That is clever.
Mm-hmm. So already you're starting to see some more conservative, little c, conservative senators like Cato and Cicero side-eyeing this up-and-comer Caesar. It's that whole optimates, populares divide again that we talked about in the beginning. So in order to counteract these men in the Senate, Caesar allied with Pompey the Great. I told you to keep his name in mind. He's a very great general. He's Caesar before Caesar. And so Caesar allies with him by marrying his only daughter, Julia, to Pompey. So now they're one big happy family.
But somebody who's not named Antonia, so that's going to help me. My lineup card was getting really complicated.
Spoiler alert, when Octavian comes around, everybody becomes named Julia, because Julia comes from the Julii.
I think I remember that from an earlier podcast that you read your
later. Everybody's Julia.
Everybody's Julia. So I'm going to enjoy this little window where people still have discrete names.
Yes. So this is where Pompey, Caesar, and Crassus, with his giant bank account, are called the first triumvirate. Whatever the Senate wanted to believe, it's really these three men who are running things. Of course, in retrospect, this alliance is only going to last so long with the ego of each man. Eventually, somebody's going to want to be top dog. But right now, they're making it work. They've done those marriage alliances. They're determined to work together. Caesar was working towards that goal of being top dog by becoming the governor of Gaul. There's technically two Gauls. There's Cisalpine Gaul, which just means on this side of the Alps, and then he got Transalpine Gaul, which is the other side of the Alps, when that governor died. So he's got all of Gaul for his conquest. He's ready to make a name for himself, as any self-respecting Roman general want to do. He wants to earn himself a triumph, which is a fancy parade in Rome.
But he also wants to narrate his successes, right? Because his writings on his experiences in Gaul do an awful lot to popularize him.
Exactly. And that's actually, it's his writings in Gaul where we get that first reference of Mark Antony in the records. His war in Gaul, as you said, is to make a name for himself, advertise it. You can't do it without some good advertisement. And he wants to basically be the new Pompey. He's like, well, isn't Pompey's getting a little old? Don't we need a new one? So he's becoming the Caesar we know and love if we love him. And it's going to bring him prestige and money. And more importantly to him, an army that's loyal to him, not just loyal to Rome, which that certainly won't cause any issues down the line.
No, I think that's a good system.
Yes.
Just make everything based on personal loyalty.
Yes. And it's here, like I said, that when Caesar's in Gaul, that Antony enters the history books. In a short period of time, he's going to be Caesar's right-hand man. In American history context, think Hamilton to Washington in the Revolutionary War.
Okay.
But not yet. So he doesn't join Caesar right away when Caesar goes to Gaul. First, Mark Antony goes to Athens in 58 BC. It's like a study abroad program. You learn oratory, all things military. Actually, Roman men tended to do this earlier than Antony was. He's already like 25 at this point. We don't know why he didn't do it earlier, probably because he was too busy drinking and womanizing, but he's doing it now.
And there is actually a little overlap between this and some of the other subjects that I teach, insofar as we think modern audiences think of Latin when they think of Rome, and they think of Rome, the city, when they think of the Roman Empire, and they should, but culturally educated people and elites, the foundational value system was still very much Greek, right?
Yes.
Yes. And that's something that I think we lose in our modern analysis. So, even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, those earliest texts are, yes, you have Hebrew, obviously, but then because we're about 100 years away from that being a meaningful subject of inquiry, but all the earliest fragments, with a few exceptions, are Greek. And so going to Greece, I suppose, would be kind of like if you were an old wealth American in the Gilded Age, you'd be sent off for the European tour. Is that kind of what it would be like?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was going to make that comparison. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, exactly. That's exactly what's happening here. It's like
Okay.
Greece, Athens, that's where you go to learn your oratory, your military. It is a little bit similar, like you said, with the Greek, with the language and such. It's like when, the 15th, 16th century, even in England, the kings were speaking French. French was the lingua franca, the language that the elites used. So here it's like, if you want to learn anything cultural, you go to Athens.
Right.
There is a hint too that the reason Antony left at this point is there's a rift between him and his BFF Clodius. That might have been one of the reasons he left for Rome. For Athens, we'll see the pair meets up later, and the reunion's not great. The hint, it involves a sword.
Oh.
So, not the last time Clodius would see the end of a sword, unfortunately for him. Antony, he would also return to Athens multiple times in the future, so we can at least assume he enjoyed the city. We know that he was a great speaker later on, which he would have crafted in Athens, although Cicero and some of the other men have this weird put down about him not doing this. Apparently there's a right kind of oratory style. It's just petty shit to put Antony down later, but we know that he learned to be a great speaker there. And then he goes and does his first campaign, not with Caesar, but with a friend of Pompey's to go to Judea. So Antony's lack of military experience did nothing to stop his bravery. We know he's noted for, during a siege, having been the first soldier to cross the fort wall of the enemy. He's very brave, even though he's new to all this. This is the start of his military life, which would take up the rest of his life. He'd be a perpetual soldier. At this time, when he's young, there'd be plenty of adventure. So Ptolemy the 12th, who's pharaoh of Egypt, he asks for help in getting his throne back from his daughter who overthrew him. He's promising a lot of money in return for the help, and Egypt has a lot of money to give if Ptolemy can get the throne back, because at present it's just promises. Ptolemy had used Roman assistants before to help him secure the throne, so this is nothing new. The Roman Senate doesn't support this mission, but Antony and the other men, they're like cartoons with the dollar signs in their eyes. They're like, All right, let's go. Antony is supposedly one of the men really pushing to go to Egypt. Screw it. They decide to go. Once in Egypt, Antony actually stops Ptolemy from indiscriminate killing, which you have to commend him for. But in the end, Ptolemy does kill his daughter, and he's back on the throne again. But Antony doesn't leave the city of Alexandria right away. At this time, Alexandria, I'm sure you know, but for people who don't, it's one of the greatest, if not the greatest city in the world. A lot of culture.
Right. It's the centerpiece of the Mediterranean world intellectually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. It was founded by Alexander the Great. That's why you get the name Alexandria. So Antony's taking advantage of all the culture, wink, wink, and did what he did best. Partied, had affairs, supposedly liked to wear, quote, very short tunics to show off his hot 28-year-old body, which go for it. If you got it, flaunt it. I do love that that's part of the evidence, though.
That's interesting because when I was looking at my notes, my college professor just only said that maybe this is not the time period when it happens, but that Antony comes to offend traditional Roman sensibilities through his Eastern style of dress. But you're saying,
Yes.
oh, okay, so that's later. So no one's necessarily offended that he's showing some skin.
Oh no,
we're not looking at Victorian era.
No. They're like, we want to see it. Show off your hot bod. I see no issues there. And it doesn't seem like they did. We don't know for sure, but there's a chance that he did meet the rest of Ptolemy's family, the royal family, including a 13-year-old Cleopatra at this time. So they might have met at this time. We don't know for sure, but it does seem kind of likely.
Little foreshadowing there.
Yeah, the paths are going to cross again, but not for a while. It's going to be a while yet. It wouldn't be long, though, before Antony goes back to Judea and then to Syria. It kind of hops back around. But then it's here that Antony heads to Gaul to link up with Caesar. We really don't know how they got connected. If Caesar invited him or Antony asked to go. Again, don't know. The full details of exactly what Antony did in Gaul are also lost to us. You already talked about Caesar's memoir of sorts of the Gallic Wars. Antony doesn't factor much in there. He does enter there a little bit, but it's not like you get a ton of stuff about him in the Gallic Wars, which I do remember reading. We had to read in French class, in French, the Gallic Wars, which no, I will not be reciting or quoting any of it in French.
Oh, wow. That's quite a challenge.
But what we do know is that within a few years, Antony had rose through the ranks to become one of Caesar's generals and, more importantly, one of Caesar's most trusted men. So this is where he's starting to look like the Mark Antony that you'd be familiar with.
Is he charismatic? Is he well-liked by his own soldiers? How does he come to be seen as... How does Caesar come to see Antony as a valuable ally?
Yeah, and that's the thing that's really hard.
Because you said he's not a brilliant tactician, so it's not that.
He does become a pretty great general, especially later on when Caesar's gone. He's kind of the number one general in the Roman world at that point. But I think right now it's more that loyalty factor, and we'll talk about that. He is really loyal to Caesar. He will always be loyal to Caesar. He must have had that je ne sais quoi, that people liked him. We do know that he inspired a lot of loyalty later on with his own people, like as a general with his own men. So I think we could probably see the origins of that here. I don't think we have anything in terms of the literature or any proof of that, but I think you could take what you see later on and say that he's cultivating that. People like him. Yeah, something about him that, the other men like him, and certainly Caesar trusted him. So I think that's kind of what we start to get. This is where he enters recorded history, and he's already a full-fledged lieutenant at that point. How he gets to that point, we don't really know.
Sure. Okay.
And while Antony and Caesar are making waves in Gaul, the cracks in that first triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus these are starting to grow more obvious. In 54 BC, one of the most important links, the marriage of Caesar's daughter, Julia to Pompey, was over when Julia died in childbirth. And then Crassus, who's I always think of as the third wheel. You kind of feel bad for him as much as you can feel bad for, a
I
billionaire.
mean, he's living in luxury. It's not like he's suffering.
No, but he's the forgotten member of the first triumvirate. Well, he doesn't want to be just known for his money. He wants to be known as a general like Caesar and Pompey. So he goes to Parthia in the east to try to get his own glory, loses horribly, be one of Rome's most disastrous defeats. And the legends say that he was made to swallow molten gold, like some sort of sick allegory of his greed.
Oh, yes, I've read that too. Right.
Yeah,
Can't be confirmed, but sounds plausible.
Yeah, Caesar would actually be planning his own expedition to Parthia to avenge Crassus when he was assassinated later on. I think the point is, with Crassus gone, you don't have a triumvirate anymore. Everything's set for a showdown between Caesar, the up-and-comer, and Pompey the Great, whose military might had kept him at the top of Rome's food chain for a while now. As for Mark Antony, he's gaining attention in more than just the military sphere. So he's able actually to go back to Rome in 53 BC to run for quaestor, which is the lowest rung of those Roman offices, with the consul being the top. So we could think of this as the start of his political career.
When you say run, this is going to be an election.
Yep, it will be an election.
Other people of his social class can vote. Okay.
Yes, and Antony's actually even going to go to Cicero for his support, which might have been a little bit galling for him, since we remember Cicero is responsible for his stepdad's death. I like to imagine Antony kind of biting his tongue, but Caesar's really helpful in terms of this. We'll see Caesar fosters a lot of his lieutenants' careers, so that would have been a very helpful alliance. At one point, back in Rome, this is when Antony runs into his old friend Clodius and chased him at sword point into a bookstore, which was apparently due to something bad that Clodius did against Cicero, or at least that's what Antony wanted Cicero to believe. Seems odd, but I do love the idea of him chasing one of his old friends with a sword into a bookstore. It's a really good image right there.
Yeah, it's a good place to hide, I would think, if it's a big bookstore.
Yeah, and Clodius, when he'd die, actually not that long later, in January of 52 BC, he's killed in a very infamous instance of political violence by one of his enemies, Milo, in this street fight, which, funny enough, the funeral pyre created for Clodius would actually burn down the Senate house. So there's a warning for you about being careful around fire, kids. Got to be careful when you light a fire.
Especially if you can't pay to have your house saved by the fire department.
Well, Crassus is dead, so you're really screwed, because you probably can't even pay anything because there's no...
You just have to watch it burn.
So no matter the strained relationship between Antony and his former friend, Antony does use his skills as an orator crafted in Athens to call for Milo to be prosecuted for the death of Clodius. We do get to see him having his first big speech. Milo does manage to escape, though, with exile instead of death. But as soon as Antony's elected quaestor, he gets out of Dodge, or Rome, so to speak. He goes back to Gaul. He goes back to Gaul to Caesar. So he's got his first office, but he helps Caesar finish off the Gallic resistance led by Vercingetorix, which, if you know anything about the Gallic, if you know the Gallic Wars, you know his name. He has a lot of statues around France as a Gallic chieftain. Antony does play a vital role in ending the war. He's able to come up with some peace terms with some of the Gallic tribes. He's really on the up and up at this point, thanks to his alliance with Caesar. In 50 BC, Antony is back in Rome. He's actually becomes augur, which is this really old religious office in Rome. It was old back in the Roman Republic, which says a lot. Caesar's support, again, is absolutely key to winning this, and you can't see Antony getting the office without it. Caesar does seem to have been really generous in helping his friends and colleagues. Of course, you have to think it's not just out of the kindness of his heart, because it's also good for him to have friends in high places. I'm going to have you try to guess what an augur did. I don't think you're going to get it, but it's a religious office. So what do you...
Oh, I think I'm going to surprise you here.
Oh, no, you know.
Yeah, because it's an old ACT word, because to augur is to foretell the future. So I assume that you had to roll dice or kill a chicken or do something to say, oh, the gods feel that the capital gains tax rate is too high. Something like that. That's my guess.
Yes, I wrote divination, bitch. They used the flights of birds in the skies to interpret omens from the Roman gods.
Oh, smart.
Yeah, very Harry Potter-esque a little bit. It does sound a little silly to us, but it's an important role. And very few people get it. There's actually only 9 augurs, and it's a role you keep for life. It's like the Supreme Court, except there's no retiring.
Okay. Does that mean you have to stare at the sky all day, or can you hire people to do that for you? Or
I think you could probably hire some people. I'm going to give you a reason why that's actually really helpful. It's not just the religious component. To quote the book, the augurs who were entrusted with interpretation of the signs could exert significant power over public life. Because if they considered that the omens were unfavorable, they could suspend all public business or even retrospectively invalidate actions or decisions that had already been taken. End quote.
Wow. So kind of an ironic office to hold for a man whose birthday will in the future be seen as a bad day to do business.
Inauspicious. Yeah. And I think you can see why it would be important then for Caesar to have someone able to interpret the birds on his behalf.
Well, it seems like a good system. I mean,
you're going to have some really pro-Caesar birds. You know, everything's going to be good for him. Not too shabby, and it's very prestigious for Mark Antony, too. They both get a little bit of something. And Julius Caesar would need all the help he could get at this juncture, because this is where his time in Gaul, that term limit, was coming to an end. It had already been extended once, and every time the issue was raised, one of Caesar's allies in Rome would stop the proceedings from getting much further. But that can go on forever. At some point, Caesar would have to relinquish the command and, more importantly, his army. Again, this is all part of that slow erosion of norms that had kept the Roman Republic propped up for so long. Caesar's not the only one violating them. Pompey the Great had been able to have troops as a governor in Spain and be consul before, which was not the normal order of things. You couldn't do both. This rivalry between Pompey and Caesar is really at the heart of things. It's really heating up at this point. To come to Rome for Caesar, giving up his governorship of Gaul, was to disband his troops, because you weren't allowed to bring troops into Italy as a governor or general.
That makes sense.
If he went, that means he would leave him at the mercy of Pompey. Finally, at last in 49 BC, after that term had expired yet again, Caesar's former ally, now enemy, Pompey, decides yes. In fact, Caesar has to vacate his post as governor of Gaul. A compromise was given by Caesar that he would leave his troops and the governorship behind in order to go to Rome to run for consul, if, and only if, Pompey also disbanded his troops. So I think it's a little like Caesar calling Pompey's bluff. So no dice. That was not going to happen. The next option was that Caesar would be given a date to disband his army. And if he chose not to, then he's going to officially be an enemy of the state.
Okay.
At this point, Antony had actually become tribune of the plebs, which we'd already talked about at the beginning in terms of things. Again, it's a powerful office that held veto powers, supposed to be a check on the Senate for the quote unquote normal people, aka the plebs or plebeians. So In this latest move against Caesar, Antony uses those veto powers. So he says, nope, you're moving against Caesar. I'm vetoing that. The senators promptly throw Antony and the other tribune out of the Senate House. So if they attempted to go back in, they'd be killed. This is unprecedented. We've heard a lot about unprecedented moves in our current American state. This is like the Roman equivalent. This is unheard of. So disguising himself as a slave, Antony leaves Rome to Caesar's side. War's coming. So that was essentially an act of war by the Senate. And with him gone, the Senate declared at long last that Caesar had to disband his army and stand trial in Rome. As you can imagine, no chance of that happening, not without a fight.
Right. So this is one of the events that people fixate on, is this is the possible end of the Republic.
It's at this point that you get the famous crossing of the Rubicon River, which is supposed to be the boundary of where Caesar's governorship stopped. So to cross that with troops without the Senate's permission is illegal. To do so meant war against Pompey and his allies. Of course, Caesar does that. That's where you get that famous phrase about crossing the Rubicon. He's at a point of no return. Pompey, for some reason, obviously didn't imagine Caesar to move this quickly and actually has to abandon Rome to reassemble elsewhere, get more troops. So Caesar was moving faster than anybody had expected. Caesar's able to take Rome itself, and he confiscates many of the houses and goods of men who had fled with Pompey. Antony was able to buy 2 of Pompey's houses himself.
Oh, nice.
I'm sure they were very luxurious. I'm sure they were very great.
And probably a buyer's market, you would think.
Very much so. Antony would be in charge of holding down Rome and essentially all of Italy for Caesar, while Caesar goes on the hunt for Pompey. It was made easier as the Romans were given this corn dole or corn ration. So if you lived in Rome, get a ration, you get food. So that keeps the populace pretty happy. Later, Cicero, when he's an enemy of Antony, would say that Antony focused solely on the army, ignoring the regular citizens, all the while bringing his mistress, who was an actress, scandal around places, including to official receptions.
Oh.
Which sounds scandalous to us, but the book points out that if this is all Cicero could lie at Antony's feet during this time, he must have done a pretty good
Must
job.
have been reasonably competent, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it seems clear that Antony did better than expected in Rome, even without Caesar. Even though at the heart of things, he's a military man. He hasn't done anything quite like this before. He had held political office, but he's still quite inexperienced for the role now given to him. To quote the book again, which I think does a really good job of sort of summing up his capabilities, he was quite capable of keeping order, both among the civilian communities and the army. Energetic and committed, Antony fulfilled his duties with determination and vigor, but without the oppressive and stern attitude that would have ruined his attempts to reconcile opposing factions. So I think we can look at this time as successful. We'll see later on, too, that Antony proves himself more than capable in preventing outright chaos in Rome, even when the city seems like it's teetering on the brink of ruin. I do think there's probably some womanizing and some drinking. He's still Mark Antony after all. He liked the finer things in life, but I do think we can think of it as a success.
So he's holding down the fort while Caesar goes in pursuit of the last surviving member of the
triumvirate.
The triumvirate. And I'm assuming that he's going to withdraw to the east or North Africa.
Pompey. Yeah. So I don't want to cover too much of the Caesar Pompey back and forth because of the military moves that won't really matter in judging Mark Antony's reputation, except to say that he proved himself to be a really useful lieutenant to Caesar. You know, for a man who had taken a long time to find his purpose, his niche, Antony had now found purpose in being Caesar's man and in being a damn good general. So, yes, okay. Pompey does go to the east, and Pompey does eventually die, not in battle, but he flees to Egypt in 48 BC, where another Ptolemy, because they're all named Ptolemy, the pharaoh, he ingratiates himself with Caesar by beheading Pompey the Great right as he comes into Egypt. So it's a really ignoble end to one of Rome's most feared and fearsome generals. After all, few acquired the honorific of the Great. Caesar, despite his enemy being gone, is upset because you can't just go around killing Roman citizens, especially Eastern men killing Roman citizens. Sets a horrible precedent. But the point is, Rome's now his. There's no triumvirate, no sharing of power. Caesar's king in all but name, and Antony's right alongside him. And I think that is where we're going to leave things today. Next time we will go obviously into Julius Caesar's time in Rome, his assassination, and all the things that come after. So hopefully you guys stick around. As always, you can reach out to us on Instagram or at our email, ambivalent.offenders.podcast@gmail.com. Please rate, subscribe, give us a 5-star review if you like that. If you like us. If not, just don't say anything. Don't hurt my feelings.
Positive reviews only, right?
Please.
Well, you can just say if it's something you don't like, you say it's the parts where the husband guests, just because I can.
You're my scapegoat. You're my fall guy.
Yeah, I've got a pretty thick skin for that kind of thing. So, instead of 30 years of teaching, we'll do that.
Well, thank you guys for joining us today, and thank you, Matthew, for joining me and learning a little bit more about Roman history.
Yeah, it's been great. And until we get Jamie back, it's exciting to be here learning and hopefully asking good questions. So
if I'm Caesar, then you're my Mark Antony, baby.
Oh, I like that.
You could do all the fun stuff. I just get killed.
I'm going to go on Amazon and see if I can find some provocative Eastern imperial clothing now.
Or I would be all for a really short tunic.
Short tunic. I can see.
Just
I'm curious to see what gets recommended to me by the algorithm after I search for short tunic.
Oh, God. I'd love to see it. All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.